Hello everyone, I am the Jack-bound sleep story and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. The headlights behind me hadn't moved for the last 20 miles. At first I thought nothing of it, just another traveler on this lonely stretch of highway. But as the minutes ticked by and the truck maintained its unnervingly consistent distance, a knot of unease began to form in the pit of my stomach. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white as I glanced in the rearview mirror for what felt like the 800th time. The truck's high beams bore into me, two piercing eyes cutting through the darkness. I couldn't make out the driver, just a shadowy silhouette behind the wheel. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator, the needle on the speedometer creeping up. The truck matched my speed effortlessly, never falling behind, never getting too close, just there, always there. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone, my boyfriend, my mom, hell, even the police. But as I unlocked the screen, my heart sank. No signal, of course. In the middle of nowhere, surrounded by towering pines and inky blackness, I was completely and utterly alone, except for the truck. A green road sign flashed by Millbrook. 30 miles, 30 miles. I could make it. I had to make it. My hands were clammy on the wheel as I tried to focus on the road ahead, but my eyes kept darting to the mirror, watching that unmoving presence behind me. I considered pulling over, but the thought of stopping, of being a sitting duck for whatever waited in that truck, sent a shiver down my spine. No, I had to keep moving, keep driving. Find help. The road curved sharply and I took the turn faster than I should have. My tires squealed in protest, and for a heart-stopping moment I thought I might lose control, but I managed to straighten out, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The truck, however, took the curve with ease, closing the gap between us for a brief, terrifying moment before falling back to its usual distance. My mind raced, trying to piece together why this was happening. Was it just some sick game, a bored trucker getting his kicks by scaring a lone woman on a dark road, or was it something worse? I thought of all the stories I'd heard, all the warnings about traveling alone at night. I'd always brushed them off, confident in my ability to handle myself. Now those warnings echoed in my head, mocking me. A flash of light caught my eye, a gas station up ahead. My heart leaped. Civilization, safety. I flicked on my turn signal, slowing down to make the exit. The truck's engine roared, and suddenly it was right behind me, so close I couldn't see its headlights in my mirror anymore. I yelped, swerving onto the exit ramp at the last second. The truck blew past, continuing down the highway. I pulled into the gas station, my whole body shaking. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, harsh and bright after the darkness of the road. I stumbled out of my car, legs weak, and made my way inside. An old man stood behind the counter, eyeing me suspiciously. "You all right, miss? You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. How could I explain what had just happened? Would he even believe me? I think someone was following me, I finally managed to croak out. The old man's expression softened. "Why don't you sit down? I'll get you some water." I nodded gratefully, collapsing onto a rickety chair by the window. As the man busied himself with getting me a drink, I stared out at the empty parking lot, half expecting to see the truck pull in at any moment. But it didn't. The lot remained empty save for my car and an old pickup that I assumed belonged to the cashier. "Here you go," the old man said, handing me a bottle of water. "Want me to call the police for you?" I shook my head. "No. I think it's okay now." They didn't follow me here. He nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. Well, you're welcome to stay here as long as you need. I'm here all night. Thank you, I said, managing a weak smile. I sat there for what felt like hours, sipping my water and trying to calm my nerves. Every car that passed on the nearby highway made me jump, my eyes darting to the window in fear. But as time passed and the truck didn't appear, I began to relax. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe it was just a coincidence, a truck heading the same way as me for a long stretch of road. The darkness and isolation had played tricks on my mind, turning an innocent situation into something sinister. Finally, I stood up, my legs steadier now. I should get going, I told the cashier. Thank you for your kindness. He nodded, concern still evident in his eyes. You be careful out there, miss. It's a dangerous world sometimes. I thanked him again and headed back to my car. As I slid into the driver's seat, I took a deep breath. The highway stretched out before me, dark and foreboding, but I steeled myself. I could do this. It was only a short drive to Millbrook now, and then I'd be safe in my warm bed, laughing at how silly I'd been. I pulled out of the gas station and back onto the highway. The road was empty now, no sign of the truck or any other vehicles. I breathed a sigh of relief, allowing myself to relax for the first time in hours. That's when I saw it. A pair of headlights in my rearview mirror, far in the distance but unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat. It couldn't be. It had to be someone else, another late-night traveler. But as the minutes ticked by and the headlights grew closer, that familiar knot of fear returned to my stomach. It was the same truck. I was sure of it. I pressed down on the accelerator, pushing my car to speeds I'd never dared before. The needle climbed higher and higher, the engine whining in protest. But no matter how fast I went, those headlights kept pace, neither falling behind nor catching up. Just there. Panic clawed at my throat. This couldn't be happening. Why was this happening? What did they want from me? I spotted a turnoff ahead, a smaller road branching off from the highway. Without thinking, I yanked the wheel, taking the turn so sharply that my tires left the ground for a moment. I sped down the narrow road, trees whipping past on either side. For a blissful moment, the headlights disappeared from my mirror. I'd lost them. I'd actually lost them. But my relief was short-lived. The road I turned onto was rough, unpaved, and it was quickly becoming apparent that it led nowhere. The trees pressed in closer, branches scraping against my car. And then, abruptly, the road ended. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a stop inches from a large fallen tree blocking the path. I was trapped. With shaking hands, I tried to turn the car around, but the road was too narrow. I could barely maneuver, and each attempt brought me perilously close to sliding into the ditch on either side. And then I heard it. The low rumble of an engine, growing louder by the second. Headlights appeared at the entrance to the road, illuminating the trees in harsh white light. The truck had found me. I abandoned my attempts to turn around and instead threw the car into reverse, trying to back up the way I'd come. But in my panic, I misjudged the width of the road. My rear tire slipped off the edge, and with a sickening lurch, my car tilted into the ditch. The engine sputtered and died. I turned the key frantically, but nothing happened. I was stuck. The truck's engine grew louder, and then it was there, blocking the road completely. There was nowhere for me to go. Nowhere to run. I was trapped. The truck's door opened with a creak, and a figure stepped out. In the harsh glare of the headlights, I couldn't make out any features, just a tall, broad silhouette moving toward me with slow, deliberate steps. I locked my doors, for all the good it would do. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. This was it. This was how it ended. The figure reached my car and stood there for a long moment, just staring. I couldn't see their eyes, but I could feel their gaze boring into me. Then, slowly, they raised their hand. I flinched, expecting what? I didn't even know what I was expecting. Violence? Death? But instead, they just knocked on my window. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I stared, frozen in disbelief and terror. The figure made no other moves, just stood there, waiting. With trembling fingers, I pressed the button to lower my window just a crack. Enough to hear, but not enough for them to reach in. "Are you okay?" The voice was gruff but unmistakably concerned. "I saw you take that turn pretty fast. Thought you might be in trouble." I blinked, my mind struggling to process what was happening. You were following me," I said, my voice trembling. The figure shifted, and suddenly, they didn't seem so menacing anymore. Just a man, middle-aged, from the sound of his voice, standing awkwardly by my car. "I'm sorry if I scared you," he said. "I'm a long-haul trucker. I saw you driving erratically back on the highway. Thought you might be drunk or falling asleep at the wheel. I was trying to keep an eye on you, make sure you didn't crash." The adrenaline that had been coursing through my veins for hours suddenly drained away, leaving me feeling weak and foolish. "Oh," was all I could manage to say. "Do you need help getting your car out of the ditch?" he asked. "I've got a tow rope in my truck." I nodded mutely, still trying to wrap my head around what had happened. As the trucker went back to his vehicle to get the rope, I sat there, alternating between relief and embarrassment. In the end, he did tow my car out of the ditch. It started up without any problems, and he even followed me all the way to Millbrook, keeping a respectful distance this time. As I pulled into my driveway, I watched his taillights disappear down the street. I felt a complex mix of emotions: gratitude for his help, lingering fear from the ordeal, and a deep sense of shame at how quickly I'd assumed the worst. That night taught me a valuable lesson. The world can be a scary place, especially for a woman alone on a dark road. But it's not always as dangerous as our fears make it out to be. Sometimes, the monsters we imagine are just people trying to help. But I still keep my doors locked when I drive at night. Just in case. The first thing I noticed was the smell: acrid, metallic, wrong. It hit me long before I stumbled into the clearing, and it made my stomach churn with a primal sort of dread. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found there: a campsite that looked like it had been torn apart by something far worse than any bear. I'd been hiking the Appalachian Trail for 3 weeks, relishing the solitude and the challenge. The weather had been perfect, the views breathtaking, and I'd fallen into a comfortable rhythm of walking, setting up camp, and falling asleep under a canopy of stars. But as I pushed through a thick patch of undergrowth that afternoon, everything changed. The clearing was small, maybe 20 feet across, ringed by towering pines that seemed to lean in, as if trying to hide what lay within. A tent, or what was left of one, lay in shreds, its fabric fluttering weakly in the breeze. The contents of a backpack were strewn across the forest floor. Clothes and gear scattered like confetti after a particularly violent party. But it was the dark stains on the pine needles that made my blood run cold. Too dark to be mud. Too red to be anything but blood. I stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, my own pack suddenly feeling like a lead weight on my shoulders. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A bear attack? But bears didn't shred tents like this, didn't scatter belongings with such purposefulness. I should leave, I thought. I should turn around right now and hike as fast as I can to the nearest ranger station. But something held me in place, a morbid curiosity mingled with a sense of responsibility. What if someone was hurt? What if they needed help? Swallowing hard, I took a tentative step into the clearing. The smell grew stronger, making me gag. I pulled my bandana up over my nose, but it did little to block out the stench. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and frightened in the eerie silence of the woods. "Is anyone here? Do you need help?" No response. Just the whisper of wind through the pines and the pounding of my own heart in my ears. I moved closer to the destroyed tent, my eyes scanning for any sign of movement, any hint of life. But there was nothing. Just destruction and those dark, ominous stains. A glint of metal caught my eye. Bending down, I saw it was a cell phone, its screen cracked but still intact. With trembling fingers, I picked it up. The battery was dead, but even that small connection to the outside world made me feel a little less alone. As I straightened up, something else caught my attention: footprints. But not the kind you'd expect to see at a campsite. These were different. Larger than any human foot I'd ever seen, with long, curved impressions at the end of each toe, like claws. A chill ran down my spine, and suddenly, the forest around me seemed much darker, much more threatening. Whatever had done this wasn't human. And it might still be out there. I needed to leave. Now. But as I turned to go, a gust of wind brought a new sound, a whimper, so faint I almost missed it. It was coming from the far side of the clearing, where the underbrush grew thick and wild. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But that sound, it could be someone in need, someone hurt. Could I really leave without checking? Cursing my own conscience, I crept toward the source of the sound, my heart thundering so loudly I was sure it would give me away to whatever might be lurking in the shadows. The underbrush was dense, thorns catching at my clothes as I pushed through. The whimpering grew louder, more distinct. It sounded animal, but not like any animal I'd ever heard before. I pushed aside a final branch and found myself staring into a small hollow formed by the roots of a massive oak. And there, huddled in the shadows, was something. At first glance, it looked like a dog. But as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I realized it was far too large to be any normal canine. Its fur was a mottled gray, matted with dirt and what looked horribly like blood. And its eyes. When it turned those eyes on me, I felt my breath catch in my throat. They were intelligent eyes, aware, and filled with a pain that seemed almost human in its intensity. The creature whimpered again, shrinking back as I took an involuntary step forward. That's when I saw the trap. Its rear leg was caught in a wicked-looking snare, the metal biting deep into flesh. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, this impossible creature and I. I knew I should be terrified. This thing, whatever it was, had likely been responsible for the carnage in the clearing. Those claws, barely visible beneath the matted fur, could tear me apart in seconds. But all I felt was pity and a strange, inexplicable urge to help. Slowly, telegraphing my movements, I shrugged off my backpack. The creature watched warily as I rummaged through it, finally pulling out my multi-tool. "It's okay," I said softly, not even sure if it could understand me. "I'm going to help you. Just, please don't eat me, all right?" As I approached, the creature growled low in its throat. But it didn't lunge, didn't bare its teeth. It just watched, those two intelligent eyes never leaving my face. The snare was tight and cruel, so it took all my strength and every ounce of my limited wilderness first aid knowledge to loosen it without causing more damage. The whole time, I was acutely aware of those eyes on me, of the hot breath that smelled of rotting meat and something else, something wild and ancient. Finally, with a last twist of the multi-tool, the snare fell away. The creature immediately pulled its injured leg close, licking at the wound with a tongue that seemed far too long for its mouth. I backed away slowly, my heart racing. What now? I couldn't exactly call animal control, and I had a feeling that even if I could, this was something far beyond their usual scope. The creature stood, shaky at first but quickly gaining strength. It was even larger than I'd first thought, easily the size of a bear when on all fours. But it didn't stand like a bear. As I watched, mouth agape, it rose onto its hind legs, towering over me. In that moment, I understood with perfect clarity what had happened in the clearing. I saw those claws, now eye level with me, and knew exactly what they could do to human flesh. I should run. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to turn and sprint as fast as I could in the opposite direction. But I remained rooted to the spot, transfixed by those eyes that now looked down on me. The creature took a step forward. I flinched, squeezing my eyes shut and waiting for the end. But instead of teeth and claws, I felt a touch, gentle, almost tender. I opened my eyes to find the creature's massive paw resting lightly on my shoulder. Its eyes, now level with mine, held an expression I could only describe as gratitude. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. With a speed that belied its size, it loped off into the forest, leaving me alone with my thundering heart and 1,000 questions. I don't know how long I stood there, trying to process what had just happened. The sun was noticeably lower in the sky by the time I finally shook myself out of my daze and made my way back to the clearing. The destruction was still there, a stark reminder that what I'd encountered was no gentle giant. This was a predator capable of terrible violence. And yet, it had shown mercy. Intelligence. Maybe even a spark of something like humanity. I knew I should report what I'd found. The rangers needed to know about the destroyed campsite, about the possibility of a dangerous animal in the area. But as I stood there, watching the lengthening shadows creep across the clearing, I realized I couldn't do it. Who would believe me? A creature larger than a bear, walking on two legs, its eyes filled with human-like awareness? They'd think I was crazy, or worse, that I was somehow responsible for the destruction around me. No, this would have to remain my secret. A story too wild, too impossible to share. As night began to fall, I hurriedly set up my own camp far from the clearing. The forest that had seemed so welcoming just that morning now felt alive with secrets and hidden dangers. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me jump. Sleep was impossible. I lay in my tent, every sense straining for any sign of the creature's return. But the night passed uneventfully. The forest was quiet, save for the usual nocturnal sounds. When dawn finally broke, I packed up quickly and hit the trail, eager to put as much distance as possible between myself and the events of the previous day. But as I hiked, my mind kept returning to those eyes. To that gentle touch on my shoulder. I realized that the forest had changed for me. It was no longer just a place of beauty and solitude. Now, it was a realm of mystery, of things beyond my understanding. Every shadow might hide a secret. Every unexplained sound could be something extraordinary. I've returned to those woods many times since that day. I've never seen the creature again, never found any sign of its existence. Sometimes, I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if the solitude and the wildness of the place had played tricks on my mind. But then I remember the weight of that paw on my shoulder, the intelligence in those eyes. And I know that out there, in the deepest, darkest parts of the forest, there are wonders and terrors beyond our wildest dreams. We just have to be brave enough or foolish enough to find them. The moment we pulled into that gas station, I knew something was off. Maybe it was the flickering neon sign, buzzing like an angry insect in the twilight. Or maybe it was the way the attendant's smile never quite reached his eyes. But as we stepped out of our minivan, stretching road-weary limbs, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd just made a terrible mistake. "Come on, Dad," my daughter Sarah whined, tugging at my sleeve. "I really need to use the bathroom." I nodded, distracted by the eerie stillness of the place. We were in the middle of nowhere, having taken a scenic route that had long since stopped being scenic and had devolved into an endless stretch of dusty road flanked by scrubland. This gas station was the first sign of civilization we'd seen in hours. "Okay, sweetie, let's go inside." As we approached the small convenience store attached to the gas station, a group of locals lounging near the entrance straightened up, their eyes fixed on us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. They were smiling, but there was something off about their expressions, too wide, too fixed, like masks poorly fitted to human faces. The bell on the door jangled as we entered, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet store. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and something else I couldn't quite place. Something organic. Rotting. "Bathrooms in the back," the attendant called out, his voice jovial but his eyes never leaving us. As we made our way through the aisles, I could feel the weight of his gaze on my back, making the hairs on my neck stand on end. Sarah disappeared into the grimy restroom while I pretended to browse the snack aisle, trying to appear casual despite the growing unease in my gut. The few other customers in the store seemed to be taking an unusual interest in our presence, their conversations dropping to hushed whispers as they watched us from the corners of their eyes. I picked up a bag of chips, more for something to do with my hands than out of any real desire for food. As I turned it over, examining the expiration date, I noticed something strange. The date was nearly a year past. Frowning, I checked another bag, then another. They were all expired, some by several years. "Finding everything all right?" The attendant's voice made me jump. He had appeared beside me silently, that fixed smile still plastered on his face. Yeah, just looking," I mumbled, putting the chips back on the shelf. "These seem to be expired, though." His smile widened fractionally, but his eyes remained cold. "Oh, Don't you worry about that. Time moves a little different out here. Everything's just fine. Before I could respond, Sarah emerged from the bathroom, her face pale. Dad, she whispered, tugging urgently at my sleeve. Can we go now, please? I nodded, relieved for the excuse to leave. Sure, honey. Let's just pay for the gas, and we'll be on our way. As we approached the counter, I noticed a bulletin board covered in missing person flyers. There were dozens of them, overlapping each other, some yellowed with age. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they all showed people who looked, well, like us. Families. Tourists. People just passing through. The attendant followed my gaze, his smile never faltering. Lot of folks come through here, he said conversationally as he rang up our purchase. Not all of them find their way back out. A chill ran down my spine at his words. What do you mean by that? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He chuckled, the sound devoid of any real mirth. Oh, you know how it is. People get lost in the desert. Make wrong turns. Sometimes they just decide to stay. I handed over the cash, eager to be done with this transaction and back on the road. But as the attendant counted out my change, his fingers lingered on my hand a moment too long. His skin was cold, almost waxy to the touch. You folks be careful out there, he said, his eyes boring into mine. It's easy to get turned around after dark. Maybe you should consider staying the night. We've got a motel just up the road. Thanks, but we really need to get going, I replied, barely managing to keep the tremor out of my voice. I grabbed Sarah's hand and headed for the door, feeling the eyes of everyone in the store following our every move. As we stepped outside, I noticed that the group of locals had grown larger. They were spread out now, some leaning against our minivan, others blocking the path to the gas pumps. All of them were smiling. Those two wide smiles. Leaving so soon, one of them called out, his voice friendly but with an undercurrent of something else. Hunger, maybe. Why don't you stay a while? We don't get many visitors out here. My heart was pounding now, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I tightened my grip on Sarah's hand and forced a smile. Thanks, but we really need to hit the road. Long drive ahead. We made our way to the minivan, the crowd parting slowly, reluctantly. I could feel their eyes on us, hear their whispers, though I couldn't make out the words. As I helped Sarah into the back seat, I noticed dark stains on the pavement near the rear tire. They looked disturbingly like drag marks. I climbed into the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I'd never been so grateful for the sound in my life. As we pulled out of the gas station, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The entire group was standing in the road behind us, watching our departure. The attendant raised his hand in farewell, that eerie smile still fixed on his face. Dad? Sarah's voice was small, frightened. What was wrong with those people? I swallowed hard, pressing down on the accelerator. I don't know, sweetie. But we're safe now. We're leaving. But even as the words left my mouth, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The road ahead forked, and neither direction looked familiar. I was sure we'd come in on a straight road, no turns for miles. But now, in the gathering darkness, nothing looked the same. I slowed the minivan, peering at the crude wooden sign at the fork. One arrow pointed left, with the word "stay" crudely painted on it. The other pointed right, reading "leave." Both words seemed to shimmer in the beam of our headlights, as if they were alive. Shifting. Changing. Which way, Dad? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. I hesitated, my mind racing. The left fork seemed to lead back toward lights, probably the motel the attendant had mentioned. The right disappeared into darkness, the road barely visible beyond the reach of our headlights. Every instinct screamed at me to take the right fork, to get as far away from this place as possible. But a nagging doubt crept in. What if it was a trick? What if leave just led us in circles, back to the gas station? What if our only hope was to stay, to face whatever was happening here head on? The decision weighed on me, each second feeling like an eternity. In the rearview mirror, I could see distant headlights approaching, someone from the gas station following us. Coming to make sure we made the right choice. Sarah's hand found mine, squeezing tight. "Dad," she whispered. "I'm scared." I took a deep breath, made my decision, and turned the wheel. As we accelerated down our chosen path, I couldn't shake the feeling that, regardless of which way we'd gone, our journey was far from over. The darkness pressed in around us, the road ahead uncertain. But we were together. And we were moving. And sometimes, in the face of the unknown, that's all you can do. The gas station disappeared behind us, swallowed by the night, but its memory lingered, a reminder that sometimes the real horrors aren't the monsters in the shadows, but the smiling faces that hide secrets too terrible to imagine. As we drove on into the uncertain night, I couldn't help but wonder how many others had faced this choice, and where their decisions had led them. All I knew for sure was that, whatever lay ahead, we'd face it together. And maybe, just maybe, we'd find our way back to a world that made sense. A world where gas station attendants didn't smile like predators, and where the concept of stay or leave wasn't a life or death decision. But deep down, I feared we'd crossed a threshold. That the world we knew was behind us now, and ahead lay only mysteries and dangers we couldn't begin to comprehend. All we could do was drive on, hope for the best, and pray that whatever forces governed this strange, twisted reality would guide us safely home. As the miles rolled by and the darkness deepened, I held tight to the steering wheel, to hope, and to the knowledge that, whatever came next, we'd face it as a family. Together in the night, driving toward an uncertain dawn. The porch steps creaked under my weight, a sound that seemed to echo across the eerily silent farmland. I'd made this trip dozens of times before, but something about today felt different. The air was thick with tension, like the calm before a storm. As I raised my hand to knock, a chill ran down my spine. Little did I know, I was about to step into a nightmare that would haunt me for years to come. My name's Sarah, and I've been a social worker in rural Missouri for the better part of a decade. I've seen my fair share of troubled families, abuse cases, and dire living conditions. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered at the Henderson farm that day. The call had come in yesterday, a concerned neighbor reporting unusual activity at the old farmhouse. Normally, I'd have brushed it off as small-town gossip. But the Hendersons had been on our radar for a while, financial troubles, rumors of domestic disputes, and a recent accident involving their youngest son had put them squarely in the at-risk category. So here I was, standing on their porch, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. I knocked again, louder this time. The sound seemed to disappear into the vastness of the surrounding cornfields. "Mrs. Henderson?" I called out. "It's Sarah from Social Services. I'm just here for a routine check-in." Silence. I tried the door handle, surprised to find it unlocked. The door swung open with a long, low creak that set my teeth on edge. "Hello? Anyone home?" The interior of the farmhouse was dim, dust motes dancing in the few shafts of sunlight that managed to penetrate the grimy windows. The living room was a mess, furniture overturned, picture frames shattered on the floor. My heart began to race. This was more than just the usual clutter of a busy family home. "Mr. Henderson? Mrs. Henderson?" I called out again, my voice echoing through the empty rooms. As I moved deeper into the house, the signs of disturbance became more pronounced. In the kitchen, drawers had been yanked open, their contents spilled across the linoleum. A chair lay on its side, one leg snapped clean off. And there, on the refrigerator door, a child's drawing was held in place by alphabet magnets. They spelled out a single word: help. My blood ran cold. I reached for my phone, ready to call for backup, only to find I had no signal. Of course, the Henderson farm was notoriously remote. A sound from upstairs made me freeze. It was faint, barely audible, but in the oppressive silence of the house, it might as well have been a gunshot. It was a cry, a child's cry. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of the house and drive as fast as I could to the nearest police station. But I couldn't. Not with a child potentially in danger. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and began to climb the stairs. Each step groaned under my weight, announcing my presence to whoever or whatever was up there. The second floor was darker than the first, the windows here boarded up from the inside. The crying grew louder as I approached a door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning me forward. "Hello?" I called out softly. "Is someone there?" "I'm here to help." The crying stopped abruptly. With trembling fingers, I pushed the door open. The room beyond was pitch black. I fumbled for my phone, using its feeble light to illuminate the space. It was a child's bedroom, or at least, it had been once. Now, it looked more like a prison cell. The walls were covered in frantic scribbles, stick figures, and monstrous shapes intertwined in a chaotic mural. The bed was overturned, its frame bent and twisted as if by some immense force. And there, huddled in the corner, was a small figure. "Hey there," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and soothing. "My name's Sarah. I'm here to help. Are you okay?" The figure didn't move, didn't respond. As I inched closer, the light from my phone revealed more details. It was a boy, no more than 8 or 9 years old. He was rocking back and forth, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees. "Can you tell me your name?" I asked, kneeling down to his level. Slowly, so slowly, the boy raised his head. I had to stifle a gasp. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and rimmed with dark circles. But it was his expression that truly chilled me to the bone. It was a look of pure, unadulterated terror. "They took them," he whispered, his voice hoarse, as if from screaming. "Who took who, sweetie?" I asked gently. "Mom and Dad. The shadows took them." I felt a prickle of unease run down my spine. "What shadows, honey? Can you tell me what happened?" The boy's eyes darted around the room, as if expecting the shadows to materialize at any moment. "They came at night," he said, his voice trembling. "I heard Mom screaming. Dad tried to fight them, but..." His voice trailed off, fresh tears welling up in his eyes. I reached out to comfort him, but he flinched away from my touch. "It's okay," I said softly. "You're safe now. I'm going to get you out of here, all right?" He shook his head violently. "No. We can't leave. They'll find us. They always find us." "Who will find us?" Before he could answer, a sound from downstairs made us both freeze. It was the unmistakable creak of the front door opening. The boy's eyes widened in terror. "They're here," he whispered. I grabbed his hand, pulling him to his feet. "We need to go. Now." We crept out of the bedroom, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it would give us away. The stairs loomed before us, a descent into unknown danger. That's when I saw them. Shadows, darker than the surrounding gloom, moving with a fluid grace that was decidedly inhuman. They were coming up the stairs. I bit back a scream, pulling the boy close to me. "Is there another way out?" I whispered urgently. He nodded, pointing to a window at the end of the hall. Without hesitation, I scooped him up and ran. Behind us, I could hear the shadows advancing, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. I fumbled with the window latch, acutely aware of the approaching danger. Finally, it gave way. I pushed the window open, feeling a rush of cool air on my face. "Hold on tight," I told the boy. And without allowing myself to think about it, I climbed out onto the sloping roof. The shingles were slick with moss, treacherous under my feet. I inched along, the boy clinging to me like a lifeline. Below us, the ground seemed impossibly far away. A sound from the window made me turn. A shadow was oozing out, reaching for us with tendrils of darkness. The boy whimpered, burying his face in my shoulder. There was nowhere left to go but down. I took a deep breath, said a silent prayer, and jumped. The impact knocked the wind out of me, pain shooting through my ankle. But there was no time to assess the damage. I staggered to my feet, the boy still in my arms, and ran. The cornfield loomed before us, stalks swaying gently in the breeze. I plunged in without hesitation, the leaves whipping at my face as I ran blindly forward. I don't know how long we ran, it could have been minutes or hours. All I knew was the burning in my lungs, the weight of the boy in my arms, and the constant gnawing fear that at any moment, those shadows would emerge from the corn and drag us into whatever hellish realm they'd taken the Hendersons. Finally, mercifully, we broke free of the cornfield. My car sat where I'd left it, a beacon of normalcy in this nightmare landscape. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. As I strapped the boy into the passenger seat, I risked a glance back at the farmhouse. It stood silhouetted against the setting sun, windows dark and empty. But I could have sworn I saw movement behind one of those windows, a writhing mass of shadow that made my skin crawl. I gunned the engine and peeled out of the driveway, gravel spraying behind us. In the rearview mirror, I watched the farmhouse recede into the distance, a dark blot on the landscape that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The boy was silent beside me, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be all right. But the words stuck in my throat. Because I knew, deep down, that nothing would ever be all right again. As we sped toward town, toward safety and rationality in a world that made sense, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd only postponed the inevitable. Someday, somehow, those shadows would find us again. And when they did, God help us all. The first time I saw the ghost, I almost convinced myself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. But by the third night, as I watched a spectral hand reach through solid walls to adjust in drip, I knew I wasn't imagining things. Something was terribly wrong in the west wing of St. Margaret's Hospital. And I was the only one who could see it. My name's Elena, and I've been a night shift nurse at St. Margaret's for 5 years. I thought I'd seen it all, the miracles, the tragedies, the long, quiet hours where life and death hang in the balance. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in those dark, sterile hallways. It started small. A wheelchair moving on its own. The faint sound of footsteps when all the patients were asleep. I brushed it off as the usual creaks and groans of an old building. But then I saw her. A woman in an outdated nurse's uniform, transparent as mist, gliding down the corridor. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. She passed right through a closed door, vanishing from sight. I rubbed my eyes, certain I was hallucinating from lack of sleep. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. The next night, I came to work determined to find a logical explanation. I threw myself into my duties, checking on patients, administering medications, anything to keep my mind occupied. But as the hours ticked by, the strange occurrences only intensified. Equipment moved on its own. Monitors flickered with impossible readings. And always, there was the ghost nurse, watching from the shadows with sad, hollow eyes. By the third night, I couldn't deny it anymore. St. Margaret's was haunted. And somehow, I was the only one who could see it. I tried to tell my coworkers, but they just laughed it off. Elena, you're working too hard, they'd say. Maybe you should take some time off. But I couldn't. Something was happening in this hospital, something beyond the realm of medical science. And I needed to understand why. It was nearing the end of my shift when things took a turn for the bizarre. I was doing my final rounds, checking on the patients in the West Wing, when I noticed something odd. The hallway seemed longer than usual. The fluorescent lights flickered ominously, casting strange shadows on the walls. I blinked, wondering if my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no, the corridor was definitely stretching, expanding, like something out of a funhouse mirror. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the truth. This wing shouldn't exist at all. St. Margaret's was an L-shaped building. I'd walked its halls countless times, memorized every turn and corner. There was no West Wing. At least, not in the waking world. Fear gripped me, but curiosity pushed me forward. I had to know what was at the end of this impossible hallway. My footsteps echoed unnaturally as I walked, the sound bouncing off walls that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. The temperature dropped dramatically, my breath fogging in the air. Goosebumps prickled along my arms as I hugged myself, trying to ward off the supernatural chill. And then I saw her again. The ghost nurse. She stood at the far end of the corridor, beckoning me with a pale, translucent hand. Her eyes, once sad, now burned with an urgent intensity. Who are you? I called out, my voice sounding small and frightened in the eerie silence. What do you want? She didn't speak. Just continued to gesture for me to follow. Against my better judgment, I did. As I drew closer, I began to make out more details. Her uniform was from the 1950s, starched and pristine. Her face was young, but her eyes held the weight of decades. And there, on her name tag, barely legible, Margaret. My blood ran cold. Margaret, as in St. Margaret's Hospital. This wasn't just any ghost. This was the spirit of the hospital's namesake. Before I could process this revelation, Margaret turned and glided through a door I hadn't noticed before. It was old, made of heavy wood with peeling paint. A faded sign hung crookedly, "Quarantine Ward." My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run from this place that shouldn't exist. But I couldn't. I'd come too far to turn back now. The door creaked open, revealing a scene from another time. Gone were the modern medical equipment and sterile white walls. Instead, I found myself in a ward straight out of the 1950s, iron bed frames lining the walls, occupied by spectral patients caught in various states of suffering. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant and something else, the cloying sweetness of decay. Margaret stood in the center of the room, her eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "What is this place?" I whispered, though I feared I already knew the answer. Margaret's voice, when she finally spoke, was like the rustle of dead leaves. "This is where it began. Where it always begins." Where what began? The sickness. Her form flickered like a candle in the wind. "It comes every few decades, a plague that defies medical science. We thought we could contain it here, in this ward. We were wrong." As she spoke, the spectral patients began to stir. Their moans filled the air, a cacophony of suffering that made my heart ache. I watched in horror as their symptoms manifested: boils erupting on translucent skin, eyes clouding over with cataracts, limbs twisting at impossible angles. "We couldn't save them," Margaret continued, her voice heavy with decades of guilt. "So many lives lost. And now, it's happening again." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean, it's happening again?" She gestured to a bed in the corner, the only one occupied by a solid, living patient. With mounting dread, I approached, recognizing the man as one of our long-term residents. Mr. Chen had been with us for months, suffering from an undiagnosable illness that had baffled our best doctors. As I looked at him now, I saw his symptoms with new eyes: the strange rash on his arms, the clouding of his vision, the unexplained fevers. They all matched the ghostly patients around us. "It's starting again," I breathed, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. Margaret nodded solemnly. "History repeats itself. The sickness has awakened. And it will spread unless..." "Unless what?" I demanded, desperation creeping into my voice. "Unless someone stops it. Someone who can see the truth. Who can bridge the gap between past and present." Her eyes bored into mine. "Someone like you, Elena." The weight of her words settled over me like a shroud. I was just a nurse, not some chosen one with mystical powers. How could I possibly stop a plague that had already claimed so many lives? But as I looked around the room at the suffering souls trapped between life and death, I knew I had to try. For them. For Mr. Chen. For all the potential victims of this resurgent illness. "What do I need to do?" I asked, squaring my shoulders. Margaret's form began to fade, the edges of her becoming indistinct. "Find the source. It's hidden in the hospital, in a place forgotten by time. The answers you seek are there. But be warned, the sickness doesn't want to be stopped. It will fight back." With those cryptic words, she vanished, along with the rest of the spectral ward. I found myself back in the normal hospital corridor, the first rays of dawn peeking through the windows. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been a vivid hallucination. But the chill lingering in my bones and the newfound knowledge burning in my mind told me otherwise. This was real. All of it. As I clocked out, my mind raced with questions. Where was this forgotten place Margaret spoke of? How could I find the source of a supernatural illness? And most pressingly, how could I convince anyone else of what I'd seen without sounding completely insane? I knew one thing for certain: my life would never be the same. I'd been given a mission, a chance to prevent history from repeating its tragic course. It wouldn't be easy, and the dangers were very real. But as I stepped out into the morning light, I felt a resolve stealing within me. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, I would uncover the truth hidden within St. Margaret's walls. I would stop this sickness before it could claim more lives. Because sometimes, the difference between life and death isn't just medicine. It's the courage to face the unknown. And the willingness to believe in the impossible. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the torrential rain as I squinted through the darkness, searching for any sign of life along the desolate highway. That's when I saw him, a lone figure illuminated by my headlights, thumb outstretched in the universal sign of a hitchhiker. I'd always been taught never to pick up strangers, but something about the desperation in his posture made me slow down. Little did I know, that simple act of kindness would plunge me into a nightmare I might never escape. I'm Dave, a traveling salesman who's seen my fair share of lonely roads and strange encounters. But nothing in my years on the road could have prepared me for what happened that stormy night on Route 16. As I pulled over, the hitchhiker rushed to my passenger side door, yanking it open and practically diving inside. The interior light revealed a man in his mid-30s, soaked to the bone, with wild eyes that darted around nervously. "Thanks, man," he panted, running a hand through his dripping hair. "I thought I was gonna be stuck out here all night." "No problem," I replied, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in my gut. "Where you headed?" "Next town over would be great," he said, his voice strained. "Name's Mike, by the way." I nodded, pulling back onto the road. "Dave." "Nice to meet you, Mike." For a few minutes, we drove in silence, the only sounds the pounding of rain on the roof and the rhythmic swish of the wipers. I snuck glances at my passenger, noticing how he kept fidgeting, his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. "So, what brings you out here on a night like this?" I asked, trying to break the tension. Mike's laugh was hollow, almost manic. "Oh, you wouldn't believe me if I told you." Something in his tone made my skin crawl. "Try me," I said, keeping my voice light. "I've heard some pretty wild stories in my line of work." He was quiet for a long moment. And when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm running from something. Something not human." I felt a chill run down my spine but forced a chuckle. "What, like a bear or something?" Mike's head snapped toward me, his eyes wide and feverish. "No, man. Something much, much worse. It killed my friends. Tore them apart right in front of me. I barely got away." My knuckles turned white on the steering wheel as I processed his words. Part of me wanted to believe this was just the ramblings of a madman or a sick joke. But the raw terror in his voice was unmistakable. What exactly did you see?" I asked, my curiosity overriding my fear. Mike shuddered, hugging himself tightly. "We were camping way out in the backcountry. No cell service, no other people for miles. It was supposed to be a fun weekend, you know? But then, on the second night, we heard these sounds. Like nothing I've ever heard before, not animal, not human. Just wrong." He paused, swallowing hard. I wanted to tell him to stop, that I didn't want to hear anymore. But I couldn't find my voice. We tried to leave, to pack up our stuff and get the hell out of there. But it found us. This thing, it was huge. All teeth and claws. And God, the smell, like rotting meat and sulfur. Tears were streaming down Mike's face now, his whole body shaking. "It took Steve first. Just ripped him in half like he was made of paper. Then Sarah, she screamed for so long." I felt bile rising in my throat, my mind reeling from the horrific images his words conjured. How did you escape?" Mike's laugh was bitter, bordering on hysterical. "Pure dumb luck. I ran. Didn't look back. Didn't stop. Just ran until I hit the highway. And now I think it's following me. As if on cue, a deafening roar cut through the sound of the rain. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, a mix of a lion's roar, a wolf's howl, and something distinctly otherworldly. The car swerved as I instinctively flinched, fighting to regain control. "It's here," Mike whispered, his face ashen. "Oh God, it found me." I pressed down on the accelerator, the speedometer climbing as we raced through the night. The rain was coming down harder now, obscuring my vision. But I didn't dare slow down. "We need to get to town," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There will be people there. Lights. Safety." Mike shook his head violently. No, you don't understand. It won't stop. It'll kill everyone. We need to lead it away. Somewhere isolated." Part of me knew he was right. If this thing was real, if it was half as dangerous as Mike described, we couldn't risk leading it to a populated area. But the idea of deliberately driving further into the wilderness, away from help, made my stomach churn. Another roar split the air, closer this time. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of movement, something massive, moving far too fast for its size. It was gaining on us. "There!" Mike shouted, pointing to a turnoff I would have missed in the rain. "That old logging road. Take it." Without thinking, I swerved onto the narrow dirt road, the car jolting violently as it hit the uneven surface. The rain was relentless, turning the road into a muddy quagmire that threatened to swallow the tires. In the rearview mirror, the thing was still there, closer now. Its shape was impossible to make out in the darkness and rain, but its glowing eyes pierced the night like twin orbs of fire. "What is that thing?" I shouted, my voice shaking as I fought to keep the car on the road. Mike didn't answer. He was staring out the window, his face a mask of terror. The road twisted and turned, the trees pressing in on either side. Each sharp curve felt like a gamble, one wrong move, and we'd skid into the trees. But stopping wasn't an option. The creature let out another roar, impossibly loud, drowning out even the thunder. And then it happened. Something slammed into the back of the car with the force of a freight train. The impact sent us skidding, the tires losing traction as the rear end fishtailed wildly. I wrestled with the wheel, heart pounding, as we careened toward the edge of the road. "Hold on!" I screamed. The car slid off the dirt path, plunging into the underbrush. Branches clawed at the windshield as we plowed through the trees, finally coming to a bone-jarring stop against a massive pine. For a moment, there was silence, save for the patter of rain on the roof and our ragged breathing. "Are you okay?" I asked, turning to Mike. He nodded, though his face was pale, and blood trickled from a gash on his forehead. "We have to move," he said, his voice shaking. "It's still out there." As if to confirm his words, a deep, guttural growl echoed through the forest. I fumbled with my seatbelt, my hands trembling, and shoved the door open. The rain was freezing, soaking me instantly as I stepped out into the night. Mike was already out of the car, looking around frantically. "This way," he shouted, darting into the trees. I hesitated for a split second, glancing back at the car. The headlights illuminated the road we'd come from, and for a moment, I thought the creature was gone. But then I saw it. A hulking shadow moving just beyond the tree line, its glowing eyes fixed on us. Adrenaline surged through me, and I sprinted after Mike. The forest was a nightmare of mud and tangled roots, the rain making every step treacherous. Branches snagged at my clothes, and more than once, I nearly lost my footing. But the sound of the creature crashing through the trees behind us kept me moving. Mike led us deeper into the woods, his path erratic, as if he didn't have a clear destination in mind. "Where are we going?" I shouted, struggling to keep up. "There's an old cabin out here," he called back. "Hunters used to use it. It's our only chance." I didn't ask how he knew about the cabin. At that moment, I didn't care. All I knew was that we needed shelter, somewhere to hide, somewhere to regroup. The growls grew louder, closer. Whatever this thing was, it was fast. Faster than us. "We're not going to make it," I panted, my lungs burning. Yes, we will. Mike shouted, a manic edge to his voice. And then, through the rain and darkness, I saw it. A faint light flickering in the distance. The cabin. Renewed hope gave me strength, and I pushed myself harder, my legs screaming in protest. Mike reached the door first, throwing it open and motioning for me to hurry. I stumbled inside, collapsing onto the wooden floor as Mike slammed the door shut behind us. The interior was small and Spartan, a single room with a cot, a wood-burning stove, and a rickety table. But it felt like a sanctuary compared to the darkness outside. Mike dragged a heavy dresser in front of the door, barricading it as best he could. Then he collapsed beside me, gasping for breath. "We can't stay here," I said between gulps of air. "That thing, it'll tear this place apart." "I know," Mike said grimly. "But we don't have a choice. We need to figure out a way to stop it." A deafening crash interrupted our conversation, the sound of something slamming against the door. The entire cabin shook, dust raining down from the ceiling. "It's here," Mike whispered, his face pale. The growls outside turned into a series of guttural snarls, each one sending a fresh wave of terror through me. The door buckled under another impact, the dresser screeching as it slid an inch across the floor. I looked around desperately, my eyes landing on a hunting rifle mounted on the wall. Without thinking, I grabbed it, checking to see if it was loaded. It was. "This won't stop it," Mike said, his voice hollow. "Then what will?" I demanded, my voice rising in panic. Mike didn't answer. Because at that moment, the door exploded inward, and the creature stepped into the cabin. The creature was a nightmare made flesh, its massive frame barely fitting through the splintered doorway. Its body was covered in matted fur, soaked from the rain, and its claws glistened with an unnatural sheen. But its eyes, those glowing, predatory eyes, were what rooted me to the spot. They burned with an intelligence far beyond any animal, locking onto us with a terrifying purpose. Mike let out a strangled cry and stumbled backward, tripping over the overturned dresser. I raised the rifle, my hands trembling so violently I could barely aim. "Stay back!" I screamed, though the command felt laughable in the face of such a monstrous thing. The creature let out a low growl, the sound vibrating through the air and rattling my bones. It crouched slightly, its muscles coiling as if preparing to pounce. I pulled the trigger. The deafening roar of the rifle filled the cabin, and the recoil nearly knocked me off my feet. The bullet struck the creature in the shoulder, jerking it to the side. But instead of falling, it let out an ear-splitting roar of fury, its eyes blazing brighter. "It's not enough!" Mike shouted, scrambling to his feet. "We have to get out of here." But there was nowhere to go. The creature blocked the only exit, its massive frame dominating the room. It lunged toward me, faster than I could react. I threw myself to the side, the creature's claws slashing through the air where I'd been a moment before. The force of its movement toppled the table, sending it crashing to the floor. "Over here!" Mike shouted, grabbing a metal poker from the wood-burning stove and waving it like a weapon. The creature turned its attention to him, its lips curling back to reveal rows of jagged teeth. I scrambled to reload the rifle, my fingers clumsy with fear. Mike swung the poker as the creature advanced, but it batted the makeshift weapon aside like it was nothing. "Mike, get down!" I shouted, finally managing to chamber another round. He dropped to the floor just as I fired again. This time, the bullet struck the creature square in the chest. It let out a guttural snarl, staggering back a step. But it didn't fall. "Why won't it die?" I screamed, panic overtaking me. Mike crawled toward me, his face pale and desperate. "It's not just an animal," he said. "It's something else, something worse. Bullets won't stop it." The creature roared again, its rage filling the small cabin like a physical force. It lunged toward us, its claws tearing into the wooden floor as it closed the distance. In a last-ditch effort, I grabbed a kerosene lamp from the floor and hurled it at the creature. The lamp shattered against its side, and the kerosene ignited instantly, flames spreading across its fur. The creature let out a scream, a sound so inhuman, so filled with pain and fury, that it made my blood run cold. It thrashed wildly, the fire consuming it as it stumbled back toward the doorway. "Now's our chance!" Mike shouted, pulling me to my feet. We bolted out of the cabin, the rain dousing us as soon as we hit the open air. Behind us, the creature's roars grew weaker, fading into the night as the fire continued to rage. We didn't stop running. Not when the cabin disappeared from view. Not when the sounds of the forest returned to normal. Not even when we finally stumbled onto the dirt road, gasping for breath and soaked to the bone. Only when the first faint light of dawn began to break through the clouds did we finally stop, collapsing onto the muddy ground. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, the forest around us eerily quiet. "Do you think it's dead?" I finally asked, my voice hoarse. Mike shook his head, his expression grim. "Something like that doesn't die easy." We sat there in silence, the weight of his words sinking in. I didn't know what the creature was, where it had come from, or why it had targeted us. But one thing was certain, we had survived. For now. And as the sun rose, casting its first rays over the drenched landscape, I couldn't help but wonder how long it would be before the nightmare found us again. The morning light felt like a fragile shield, a thin veil separating us from the horrors of the night. Mike and I trudged along the muddy road in silence, our exhaustion too heavy for conversation. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call sent a jolt of tension through me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those glowing eyes emerge from the forest. But the creature didn't come. Eventually, the road led us to a small town, a cluster of houses, a gas station, and a diner that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s. The neon sign over the diner flickered faintly, the word open glowing like a beacon. "Let's go inside," Mike said, his voice rough. "We need to regroup." I nodded, too tired to argue. The bell over the door jingled as we stepped inside, the warm smell of coffee and frying bacon washing over us. A waitress looked up from behind the counter, her brow furrowing as she took in our disheveled appearances. "Rough night?" she asked, pouring a cup of coffee and sliding it toward us without waiting for an answer. "You could say that," Mike muttered, sinking into a booth. I sat across from him, my hands wrapped around the warm mug as if it could chase away the lingering chill. For a while, we didn't speak. The hum of the diner, clinking silverware, soft conversations, the low murmur of a radio felt almost surreal after the chaos of the night. Finally, Mike broke the silence. "We can't stay here long." I looked up, startled. "What are you talking about?" "That thing, whatever it was, is probably dead. We should call someone, tell them what happened." Mike shook his head, his expression grim. "You don't get it. This isn't over. That thing, it's part of something bigger. Something that doesn't stop just because you set it on fire." His words sent a chill through me. "What do you mean, something bigger?" Mike leaned in, lowering his voice. "I've seen things, Dave. Things most people wouldn't believe. That creature last night, it's not the first one I've encountered. And it won't be the last." I stared at him, my coffee forgotten. "You've seen others?" He nodded. "They're out there. Different shapes, different sizes. But they're all connected somehow. I don't know why, but they're drawn to certain places, certain people." "Like you?" Mike's jaw tightened. "Yeah. Like me." The weight of his words settled over me like a stone. I wanted to dismiss him, to chalk it up to paranoia or trauma. But after what I'd seen, I couldn't. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mike was silent for a long time, his gaze distant. Finally, he looked at me, his eyes hard. "We keep moving. We don't stay in one place too long. And we watch each other's backs." It wasn't the answer I wanted. I wanted closure, certainty, a way to make sense of the nightmare we'd survived. But deep down, I knew he was right. The world wasn't as simple as I'd thought. There were things out there in the darkness, things that defied logic, things that would haunt me for the rest of my life. And if we stayed here, we'd only be putting these unsuspecting people in danger. I finished my coffee in silence, the weight of our situation pressing down on me. When the waitress came by to refill our cups, I forced a smile. "Thanks," I said. "No problem," she replied, her tone cheerful. "You boys take care now, you hear?" I nodded, but her words felt hollow. Take care. As if it were that simple. Mike and I left the diner a few minutes later, the bell jingling faintly behind us. The sun was higher in the sky now, the town bathed in golden light. It looked so peaceful, so ordinary. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Mike must have felt it too because he picked up the pace, heading for the edge of town. We didn't have a plan, not really. All we knew was that we had to keep moving. Because out there, in the shadows, the nightmare was waiting. And it wasn't done with us yet. As we left the diner behind, the road stretched ahead of us like a promise and a threat. The town shrank in the rearview mirror, its peaceful facade a stark contrast to the storm of fear and uncertainty raging inside me. Mike drove in silence, his hands gripping the wheel tightly, his eyes scanning the horizon. I sat beside him, my thoughts spinning in endless circles. What were we running from? What had we stumbled into? And how long could we keep this up before whatever was chasing us finally caught up? Hours passed, the landscape blurring into an endless monotony of trees and hills. The rain had stopped, but the clouds lingered, heavy and oppressive, as if the sky itself was weighing down on us. Eventually, Mike broke the silence. "We need to figure out where to go next." I glanced at him, surprised by the calm in his voice. "And where's that?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "There's a place. About a day's drive from here. An old friend of mine runs a sort of safe house." "A safe house?" I repeated, the skepticism clear in my tone. Mike nodded. "It's a place for people like us. People who've seen the things out there. He can help us figure out what's going on." "And you trust him?" Mike's grip on the wheel tightened, his knuckles white. "As much as I trust anyone these days." It wasn't exactly a ringing endorsement, but I didn't have any better ideas. "Fine," I said. "But if this friend of yours turns out to be another problem, I'm out." Mike nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Fair enough." The miles rolled on, the tension in the car easing slightly as the sun began to break through the clouds. For a brief, fleeting moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we'd left the nightmare behind. But that hope was shattered when we stopped for gas at a tiny, rundown station on the edge of nowhere. The moment we pulled in, I felt it, a sense of wrongness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The station was deserted, the pumps old and rusted, the windows of the attached convenience store grimy and cracked. Mike noticed it too, his eyes narrowing as he killed the engine. "Stay here," he said, opening the door. "What?" "No way," I protested, unbuckling my seatbelt. Mike shook his head. "If something's off, I don't want you out in the open. Stay in the car and keep the doors locked. If I'm not back in 5 minutes, you drive." The seriousness in his tone left no room for argument. I nodded reluctantly, watching as he disappeared into the store. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling longer than the last. I kept glancing at the clock, my anxiety growing with every tick of the second hand. 4 minutes passed. Then 5. Still, no sign of Mike. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my mind racing. Should I wait? Or should I follow him? As I debated, a shadow moved in the corner of my vision. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was outside the car, just beyond the edge of the gas station's weak overhead light. For a moment, I thought it might be Mike. But then I saw the eyes, glowing faintly in the dim light. It wasn't him. The creature was back. The glowing eyes locked onto me, unblinking and full of predatory intent. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I fought the urge to scream. The creature didn't move, its massive form half hidden in the shadows, but the tension in the air was suffocating. I reached for the door lock to make sure it was secure, my fingers trembling. Suddenly, the headlights of the car flickered. For a moment, the gas station was plunged into darkness, and when the lights came back on, the creature was closer. My heart pounded as I realized it wasn't walking, it was somehow gliding through the shadows, closing the distance without making a sound. "Mike, where are you?" I whispered, my voice shaking. I debated whether to honk the horn or flash the lights to signal him, but I didn't want to draw the creature's attention any more than I already had. The creature took another step forward, its form coming into sharper focus under the dim glow of the station lights. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with limbs that were unnaturally long and sinewy. Its skin was mottled and dark, almost blending into the shadows, and its claws gleamed like polished obsidian. But its eyes were the worst. They weren't just glowing, they seemed alive, swirling with an unnatural energy that made my stomach churn. I fumbled for my phone, praying for a signal, but of course, there was none. The creature tilted its head, as if sensing my desperation. Its lips pulled back in what could only be described as a grotesque smile, revealing rows of jagged, uneven teeth. The car felt like a flimsy shield, offering no real protection against something so powerful. I had to do something. I reached for the keys in the ignition, my plan to drive away forming in the haze of my panic. But as soon as I touched them, the creature moved. In a blur of motion, it was at the hood of the car, its claws raking across the metal with an ear-splitting screech. I screamed, throwing the car into reverse and slamming on the gas. The tires spun on the wet pavement before catching, and the car lurched backward. The creature didn't flinch. Instead, it leapt onto the roof, the impact rocking the vehicle violently. I hit the brakes, trying to shake it off, but it clung to the car with terrifying strength. Its claws punched through the roof, tearing into the metal as if it were paper. I ducked as one of the claws scraped past my head, missing me by inches. "Get off!" I shouted, slamming the accelerator again and steering wildly in an attempt to throw it off balance. The car careened backward, smashing into one of the rusted gas pumps. The impact threw me forward, my head slamming against the steering wheel. Dazed, I struggled to focus as the creature leapt off the roof and landed in front of the car. It crouched low, preparing to strike. And then, a shot rang out. The creature reared back, a pained roar tearing through the night. I turned to see Mike standing in the doorway of the convenience store, a shotgun in his hands. "Get out of the car," he shouted, firing again. The creature snarled, its glowing eyes narrowing as it turned its attention to him. I didn't need to be told twice. I threw open the door and stumbled out, my legs shaky but functional. Mike motioned for me to follow him as he backed into the store, the shotgun aimed at the creature. "Hurry," he barked. I sprinted toward him, the sound of the creature's growls close behind. Mike fired another shot, the recoil knocking him back a step. "Inside, now," he yelled as I reached the door. We slammed it shut behind us, the lock clicking into place. For a moment, there was silence. Then the creature's claws scraped against the glass, a slow, deliberate sound that set my teeth on edge. "We can't stay here," I panted, my chest heaving. Mike nodded, his jaw set. "Help me block the doors." We grabbed anything we could find, shelves, boxes, even a vending machine, and pushed them against the entrance. The creature's growls grew louder, more aggressive, as it began to pound against the glass. The door shuddered under the force of its attacks, the glass starting to crack. "This won't hold for long," I said, fear tightening my throat. Mike glanced around, his eyes scanning the small store. "There's a back exit," he said. "We'll make a run for it." Another deafening crash echoed through the store as the creature rammed the door again, the glass splintering further. "Go!" Mike shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the back. We ran through a narrow hallway that led to a steel door. Mike shoved it open, and we spilled out into the rain-soaked night. Behind us, the sound of the creature tearing through the barricade sent a fresh wave of panic through me. "Where now?" I gasped, looking around wildly. "There's a drainage ditch behind the station," Mike said. "We can use it to lose the trail." We scrambled down the embankment, mud and water splashing around us as we slid into the ditch. The creature's roar echoed through the night, closer than I wanted it to be. "Keep moving," Mike urged, his voice strained. We waded through the muck, the cold water biting at my skin as the ditch led us deeper into the forest. The sounds of the creature grew fainter, but I knew better than to think we were safe. Whatever this thing was, it wouldn't stop until it had us. And as we disappeared into the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being herded. Driven towards something even worse. The ditch twisted and turned through the dense forest, the overhanging trees blotting out what little light the moon provided. We stumbled along, our breaths ragged, the cold water soaking us to the bone. Behind us, the creature's roars had faded, but the silence was no comfort. It wasn't gone, it was hunting. Mike led the way, his pace relentless. Do you even know where this leads? I asked, struggling to keep up. No idea, he admitted. But as long as it's away from that thing, I'm fine with it. Branches snagged at my clothes as we climbed out of the ditch and into a clearing. The ground was firmer here, the trees spaced farther apart, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I could see the night sky. We should rest, I said, my legs trembling from exhaustion. Mike hesitated, scanning the clearing with narrowed eyes.